I'm going to start off by giving a very short introduction to the topic of space imports and the related challenges. And after that, I'm going to hand over to Bavo Smets with Seas at Risk's shipping policy team, who will introduce and give the floor to our three distinguished speakers. I do also have to offer apologies. We had hoped that Alec Bagu from Fluxus would be able to join us, but unfortunately he's had to cancel. But we will have three good speakers today, and I think you'll enjoy what they have to say. They will each give a presentation on some of the main challenges facing us today in the context of space imports. And as well as highlighting solutions, they will show that from their experience what is happening. Bavo will then pose questions to the speakers, including questions from you, the audience, and there will be the time for the Q&A session. Hopefully, as I say, we'll be able to take all of the questions during that session today. So just to get us started and to set the scene and the rationale behind today's webinar. The world is changing. Currently, we are living beyond the means of the planet, and we have exceeded 7 of 9 identified planetary boundaries, including climate change, biogeochemical flows, that's things like nitrogen and phosphorus emissions, and ocean acidification, to name just 3. We are facing a triple planetary crisis: climate heating, pollution, and loss of biodiversity. We must urgently address these pressures by implementing much-needed adaptation and mitigation measures. Seas at Risk's shipping team's focus is on the requirements for energy transition, the importance of protecting ecosystems and biodiversity, addressing pollution prevention and circularity, and ensuring that the fundamental, just and equitable, and precautionary principles are embedded in the maritime space, that is in shipping and port policy. In this space, ports are pivotal actors. They are the interface between the land and the sea, between trade and people, between the past and the future. Historically, ports were centres for trade and communities, with human settlement developing around trading ports. And today, many ports remain at the centre of food, trade, economic and social hubs. As such, ports have the potential to be the engines for climate resilience, ecological regeneration, and a just transition. But while they are powerful levers for change, ports are also highly exposed. They are focuses for air pollution, ocean pollution, underwater noise, and contribute to ecological and blue carbon sink degradation. Due to the expanding spatial demands to accommodate ever-growing sizes of ships, increasing alternative fuel needs, military expansion, coastal defences, offshore renewable developments, and more. A year ago, Seas at Risk launched a new report with a new vision, One Planet Shipping. The purpose of the report was to encourage new conversations and campaigns and the development of new policies around or using positive language. It consists of 4 new narratives. Wind First, promoting wind propulsion as a free, truly renewable and viable alternative to fossil fuels. Reimagining Trade, on moving less cargo long distances and reducing the burden on the environment and people. All Aboard, including all stakeholders in a just transition. And Homeward Bound, highlighting the role of ports as vital, resilient hubs for trade and for a one planet future. Today's webinar will delve more deeply into these issues and into the need for a strong, strategic and sustainable port policy. I'm now going to hand over to Bavo to take over the reins and to introduce our speakers. Over to you, Bavo.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sean, for setting the scene, and a very good morning to everyone. Sean, as you said, ports experience growing spatial pressures linked to both existing and upcoming activities, such as the fuel transition, growing offshore renewables sector, but also military expansion, ever-growing ship sizes. You've named some of them. Now, those Pressures also bring about important questions on how ports can indeed intelligently react to the pressure in a way that takes the energy transition forward and does not further compromise the natural and the urban environment of ports. Those questions are crucial as much as they are complex. So I am actually very happy that I can leave it today to our three knowledgeable speakers to try and formulate an answer. And our first speaker is Lucy Gilliam. Lucy is an environmental scientist with extensive experience as a science advisor, but also as a sailor and in the field of ocean advocacy. In 2024, she co-founded One Planet Port, a science-driven initiative dedicated to accelerating the ecological transition in the port of Rotterdam and ensuring the port transforms and operates within the planetary boundaries. Lucy, I cannot wait to hear your take on the issue of space in ports. I would say the floor is yours, and if you want to present some slides, you should be able to do so.
Great, thank you. I'm just loading my slides now. Okay, can you see my first slide?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, well, brilliant. Thanks for the introduction, Sian and Bavo. I'm Lucy Gilliam. I'm an environmental scientist turned campaigner. I co-lead One Planet Port. It's a foundation based in Rotterdam, and we bring together communities, researchers, policymakers to reimagine ports and maritime activities for a livable planet. We aim to support ports in the transition to move away from being fossil-based industrial hubs to being hubs of clean energy and circular material flows. And the way that we do that is through collaborations with people working on spatial planning, on governance innovation, and also development of practical strategies and plans. So we've been doing a lot of work on visioning what a One Planet Port might be and how the Port of Rotterdam can lead this transition. And what's key is, like, because of the scale and the complexity of this challenge, no one single actor can do this alone. So it really does require a team effort and really more stakeholders to engage in this challenge. So ports really sit at the front line of the energy and the material transition. They are gateways of trade, they are fossil industry hotspots, but they are positioned to become key hubs for offshore wind and green hydrogen and electrified shipping and circular economy activities. But the shift isn't just technological, it's or economic. It's profoundly spatial because the land that we have available is finite, it's contested, and it's locked into legacy uses. So how well we manage space will determine whether ports can successfully transition. So the first thing is the competing land uses. So traditional functions like cargo handling and warehousing already occupy vast amounts of waterfront areas. But the transition will require more activities in these areas. So, the assembly of offshore wind turbines and the maintenance of them. We also need to build electrolyzers, and we need to store hydrogen. And one of the challenges is that most of the hydrogen carriers and the new energy that we're looking to store in our ports is less energy dense than the fossil fuels that they're replacing. So that's already a challenge in terms of space. We also need circular economy infrastructure. We need space for recycling. We need space for repair. We need space for processing these feedstocks in the circular and the renewable economy. We also need place for high voltage substations and grid links and cabling and piping. And perhaps we also need new shipping terminals for the dedicated ships that are supporting this transition. Also, one of the big challenges that we have is the challenge of nitrogen pollution. So it's not just we're trying to solve the climate problem, but we're also trying to solve the other environmental challenges. And one of the critical challenges that we've got is nitrogen pollution. And so, these rules do delay building of okay, maybe it's the slides that are causing the problem. Okay, so I was talking about, so new infrastructure needs to coexist with the systems that are already in place. So oil terminals may be operating next to new build hydrogen plants. So construction phases require different layouts. And we need to plan through time as well as in space. So there are examples underway. So Rotterdam has been mapping hydrogen valleys and carbon networks, and also has a circularity plan that they're developing out to 2050 vision. Antwerp Bruges has planned shared corridors and co-location of industrial spaces to generate symbiosis. And a lot of smaller ports actually are testing multi-use zones. But what's key to this is early integrated spatial planning with the energy circular economy industry, municipalities, but also critically communities. And we need to do scenario modeling to visualize, to make decisions around the trade-offs. And perhaps it's also wise to think about flexible zoning and phased redevelopment so that we don't get lock-in to technology that's perhaps inefficient or not needed in the future. So the energy and the circular transition will reshape ports, but the spatial constraints are a critical bottleneck. Ports that plan early, coordinate well, and use land intelligence will thrive. And what we're doing with it at One Planet Port is we're developing shared visions for ports within planetary boundaries. So we have a report coming out later this year. We're also building communities to give citizens voice in those plans around port developments. And finally, we're building an observatory to track the flows of energy, material, and trade, and to support real-time spatial decision-making on the future of ports. Join us in helping shape this transition. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lucy. That was interesting, and I think it covered already a lot of things. But we're only getting started because our next speaker is David Newman. David is a Policy and Research Officer at ZESTAS, the Zero Emission Ship Technology Association. As an engineer and environmental scientist, David's work focuses mainly on the uptake and the safety issues of hydrogen in the maritime sector. And over the past 5 years, he as well coordinated numerous submissions to the International Maritime Organization, the IMO. So I think we are very lucky that David found some time today to join us, given that the important IMO MEPC extraordinary session is taking place this week, and actually as we speak. So David, I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on space challenges in ports and how they relate to the energy transition. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Bavo. And thank you, Sean, and everyone in Seas at Risk for organizing today's webinar. Let me just open my slides. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
I'll just change slide to make sure that works.
Perfect.
Okay, great. So thank you very much, Lucy, for your presentation. Really informative and well done for getting through the difficult technical challenges, but I think we all came out of it with a really good overview of what the challenges are with space in ports. And I'd also like to echo your message about collaboration across stakeholders, because that's the most important thing for getting through challenges, to have a holistic view and bring in all sides of the shipping industry. So I'm speaking today on behalf of ZESTAS. We are an international trade association with the consultative status of the IMO. I've been with ZESTAS for 5 years, and I'm involved with a lot of work at the IMO. Also, since a year, I've been working on inland vessels as a sailor, get my certificate, so that's been great to get hands-on experience of ports and shipping, mainly in Benelux and the Rhine. So Zestis has over 60 members across lots of all aspects of the shipping industry, from ships to ports to infrastructure, law, finance, and also disruptive so innovators, so reshaping the sector. And our last event was a month ago in London International Shipping Week at the IMO, where we brought together these stakeholders to show that technology for zero emissions ocean-going shipping is actually here today, when we combine all the existing technologies. So I coordinated a policy brief that came out of that, which you can download. There'll be a bigger QR code at the end in case you don't have time to scan it now. And we had the honor of welcoming the Secretary General of the IMO, who gave a keynote speech and emphasized the need to protect the planet for future generations. So, as Bavo noted, it's a very important week at the IMO for zero emissions shipping, because this week there'll be the vote on the net zero framework to ratify it, and this will put in place a system that will reward ship owners who go above and beyond with reducing their emissions and punish polluters. And the funds collected, excess funds, will stay in the sector to mitigate climate change for least developed countries and small island developing states. So what is the latest technology available? So very exciting times, because last week the first primary wind-propelled industrial cargo ocean-going ship went into service. That's Neoliner Origin on the left, with emissions reductions between 80 and 90%. So that reduces the fuel demand massively, and it's carrying ro-ro cargo across the Atlantic. And we also have large uptake of battery and energy storage technologies. In this photo is the largest fully electric ship, 40 megawatt hour battery pack, which will travel between Buenos Aires and Montevideo in Uruguay. And below we have also uptake in hydrogen ship technology. So there are about 30 commercial vessels with fuel cells installed that are in service, under construction, or final investment decision. Here, this is a very interesting case, is the Hydra ferry in Norway, because it has liquid hydrogen fuel, which means a smaller volume required, so a smaller tank, and also much faster bunkering rate than gaseous hydrogen. And they have a 98% uptime since 2023, which is best in the Norled's fleet of electric and diesel vessels. So actually has been more reliable than conventional ships. And so hydrogen is the only alternative fuel that is guaranteed no greenhouse gas emissions inherently. And I can touch on more of that later, but I think I'll leave that for the Q&A. But it's also, I just want to touch on quickly how it is the most efficient use of renewable energy, which is the scarce resource that we need a lot of. And it's also shown to be more space and weight efficient on vessels than other alternative fuels. So if we combine all the technologies available that I just spoke about earlier, we can actually see that ocean-going shipping is possible now. And the very interesting case with Norled's Hydra vessel that you see on the top is that it was deliberately over-engineered so that the technologies could be scaled up for larger vessels. So we can see 10 plus megawatt power capacity in fuel cells is technically possible based on the proven technology existing now, which means coastal and ocean-going ships when we reduce the fuel demand. And then also, so that's all well and good for new vessels, but what about the aging fleet, well, there are a lot of other proven technologies on older vessels, such as wind propulsion, which is a large, fast-growing sector where you can actually see very significant fuel savings on vessels that are maybe the most polluting in the fleet. And with the net zero framework, ship owners can gain rewards for those things. And then you've got also hybrid technology, electrification, air hull lubrication as well. So what this means for ports is actually that the fuel demand may not be as large as what we might think if we compare with existing fossil fuels, where you take into account the high efficient use of energy and the wind propulsion. So my recommendation, or Zesta's recommendation for ports, would be to really start small. And here on the bottom, on these pictures, you can see real life hydrogen refueling infrastructure. And you'll see that it's actually not so space demanding. So there's you can have the hydrogen stored somewhere else, usually next to the production, next to the electrolyzers, which don't have to be located in the port, and it can be delivered by truck with a small bunkering tower. On the bottom left is a Unitrove's liquid bunkering apparatus, which is, as you can see, is very small scale, but can deliver a fast rate of bunkering. And on the right is a photo I took while sailing on an inland chemical tanker when we had the fortune to pass in Amsterdam the H2 Barge 1 hydrogen-powered vessel, which was being bunkered, where you can see there it's a container being swapped, a gaseous hydrogen container. So that, as well as using existing infrastructure, and has very little demand for space. So I'm almost out of time, I believe. So I'm going to wrap up. So for ports, the important thing is to start small and be proactive. So get permits for handling hydrogen. This changes a lot between different countries. So you have to really be proactive, talk to the local port authority, talk to the regulator. It's usually a small X zone based on LNG ISO standards with a hazard zone and safety zone. And also, if we can sort of deploy a lot of small refueling stations, then we can really see a lot of learning and exchange and knowledge transfer between ports. And it's also a good idea for smaller ports to kind of get an edge on their larger competitors. And then as well, be very supportive and welcoming for wind propulsion, because there may be small changes in operations, but what we heard actually from ship owners who've installed wind propulsion is that as soon as the ports get the hang of wind propulsion and understand the small changes in operations required, they're very interested and very sometimes can even will be welcome to give incentives to these kind of vessels. And then as well, for shore power, it may be it would be wise to invest in battery storage hydrogen fuel cells to ensure that to bypass the grid limitations. So if you want to download, please scan the QR code to download the Zesta Ship 030 policy brief. And I'd like to thank you all for listening today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. I will
It's trying to cram it all in, you know.
and it's a lot. Okay, you can see my screen? Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Super interesting. Also very interesting that you mentioned the wind propulsion as part of the solution. I think that makes sense. Thank you, David. And our third and final speaker is Andon, Senior Policy Advisor at Seas at Risk. Anne brings over 30 years of experience in EU environmental policies, having previously worked for for both the European Commission and the European Environmental Agency on transport and environmental issues. At Seas at Risk, her work focuses on maritime spatial planning and offshore renewable energy, but as well on the intersectionality between the different marine policy fields and on system change thinking as well. So I'm actually really looking forward to hearing your perspective on how space challenges and ports link into all that and link into system change thinking. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Bavo. I can't see myself, but I presume you can all see me. I didn't bring any slides. And I would also like to thank Lucy and David for already highlighting some very important aspects of ports development and the space squeeze we see happening in many places. Myself, I live in Antwerp, which is the second largest port, I believe, in Europe after Rotterdam. And of course, this is a prime example of how, for instance, competition between two ports over the centuries have been driving very intensive expansions of the ports. Ports that started within city centers and very much shaped also the cities they were connected to, and then moved out of it with vast industrial zones linked to it, of course, impacting very much space-wise on the villages surrounding the bigger cities, impacting very much on nature and farmland surrounding it, and of course still causing many impacts on cities, pollution-wise, and in many other ways. I think cities are definitely at a cross point, and I'm focusing now on ports. I'm focusing on European ports, very much at the crossroads, as the world is also as a crossroad, as we can witness from various geopolitical developments. Ports, on the one hand, their development and their space extension is, of course, very linked to international trade, to the trends we see in consumption and production all over the world. At Seas at Risk, we very much advocate for changing that kind of economies into more sufficiency economies. So we are advocating a shift away from overconsumption and a throwaway economy towards sufficiency economies. That relates very much, of course, to the way we use, on the one hand, energy, and the previous speakers already tackled that topic. We have a choice here as Europe and as the world to either keep being locked into fossil fuels or to move to renewable fuels. Both need space, obviously, in ports. The lock-in of fossil fuels requires, for instance, also space for a sector that hasn't been mentioned yet, namely the carbon capture and storage. That is a future scenario in which we do not manage, for instance, in Europe, to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to zero, and still need to capture part of it and store it, for instance, under the seabed. The EU's ambitions for that are huge. The aim is to have 50 megatons of carbon captured in Europe by 2030, and then transport part of it by pipelines to ports and or by ships, and then transport part of it to, for instance, the North Sea, to store it there under the seabed. So that will require huge amounts of space in ports. That will require an enormous amount of ships, additional ships and pipelines to connect the ports with the hinterland and the seas itself. So that is an example, a worrying example of what could happen to ports if we keep being locked into the fossil world view. Another important thing is how we see the future on materials. The circular economy has already been mentioned. That is, of course, part of the overall discussion. Of course, we hope that we will get an economy that turns fully circular, but in addition to that, also we really need demand management to reduce the overall demand for products and services. Some years ago, Seas at Risk published a report breaking free from mining that was done in the light of our deep sea mining work, and envisaged a world in which we do not need deep sea mining, and we also do no longer need terrestrial mining. It would be great to envisage what that means for shipping and ports, because a large part of the cargo that is now being transported by ship is, of course, related to metals and other raw materials. Envisaging this world, this efficiency world, combined with circularity, I'm sure would have huge impacts on ports, space-wise. Could we even envisage ports shrinking? I wonder, because after all, this endless growth mindset that many ports now have, and I refer back to the dynamic between Antwerp and Rotterdam, the dynamic there has always been, okay, Antwerp always needs to extend because otherwise container ships will move to Rotterdam and vice versa. So there's a dynamic there that drives both ports to extend, to always become larger. And of course, there is a dynamic trade-wise also, the growing trade globally. What will happen if that reverses, as Seas at Risk One Planet Ship report also investigates what will happen to ports when that growing trade trend reverses, because we go more for regional trade and short distance trade of lesser products once we have broken through the overconsumption society. So I think this just poses many questions about the future of ports. I think the upcoming European port strategy is a really exciting moment, I think, to rethink the future of Europe's ports, especially also in light of the fact that climate change is now hard upon us, and ports are really at the front of that battle. Climate change, which will change our coasts, climate change, which will squeeze even more the space available for ports, which might make ports consider to move further inland in certain cases. Extreme weather events, where also ports play an important role. Also, in that sense, I think ports can play an important mitigation role if they develop hand in hand with nature, and if they not only extend their surface by concrete and steel, but also work together with nature, help restore wetlands, help restore marine ecosystems that can temper the impacts of climate change. So there you go. I just wanted to flag some additional elements to be considered in the futures of ports, and the two futures that ports can choose between: a worldview in which we keep being locked in fossil fuels and overproduction and consumption of materials and other goods, or a world in which ports might be able, for instance, to shrink, are running on renewable energy, work hand in hand with nature, and work also hand in hand with the citizens that live nearby.
Right. Thank you very much, Anne, for, I would say, for opening it up even more. You mentioned circular economy, sufficiency thinking, nature conservation, and I think the link to ports and space imports is very important as well. A lot of additional questions it raises, of course, and we might end up with more questions than in the beginning, but that's fine. And maybe actually not, because we will now move to a part where some questions can be answered. It's time for the Q&A session. It's during the Q&A session, our speakers will happily answer all of your questions. So please feel free to write anything you want to ask. Well, a bit related to the topic, maybe to one of our speakers, and if possible, please indicate as well what speaker you want to direct your question to. Yeah, I would like to ask for the speakers to turn on their cameras so we can see everyone. And for the public, you should be able to find the Q&A button towards the bottom of your page. It should be straightforward. Voila. That's that. While we give you, I see there's already a question popping up, but while we give you some more time to write down your questions, I can maybe kick off with burning question to Lucy, because Lucy, you work in Rotterdam, you work on Rotterdam, and Rotterdam historically is also an interesting case. I feel like when we're talking about port expansion, and there was this eerste Maasvlakte, the expansion into the sea, then there came the tweede Maasvlakte. I hear conversations about potentially getting a derde Maasvlakte, a third one, third expansion into the sea, allowing for spatial and economic growth. There's always this narrative of economic growth, and I was just wondering, how do you react to this, and also to the claim that we need, in fact, those expansions for our societies and to safeguard the thriving economies? Maybe then linked to that, it's more in general, how can we actually introduce those planetary boundaries that you work so hard on into discussion on ports, which is essentially an environment that runs on very rigid economic logics?
Yeah, a number of questions in there, I think. I mean, the history of Rotterdam is that you have a city that's expanded out seaward, and this expansion has happened really over the last 100 years, although the port has really been there for a lot longer, almost 750 years. But what we've seen is post-war a massive expansion towards the sea, as we've built like trade harbours, petroleum harbours, oil refineries, chemical plants, etc. And in that process, you know, the economic imperative of growth has overridden, you know, the local communities that lived alongside, and also the nature. So in the development of Rotterdam, we lost whole entire villages, and you lost farms and farmland, and people were displaced. And you also lost a whole area of nature called the Bear. And there's a tiny fraction of that nature reserve that's like left as you drive the 45 kilometers out towards the Maasvlakte. So development has been at the cost of nature, and it has been at the cost of some communities. And there's not really much more space to expand, because there is still remaining very important Natura 2000 nature reserve that lies to the south, and then very dense industrial and urban conurbations that lie all around the port. So that's, you know, ultimately what led to the expansion into the sea. So like the Europort and the Maasvlakte 1 and 2, they've claimed land and built new land in order to expand that port port territory. And the question is now, what is the future? I mean, I think the dominant logic is that we need more space, so we're going to reclaim more land and we're going to build out into the sea. But I think we really want to question that and make sure that we're not unnecessarily taking away from nature and communities in doing so. And there are areas there will be kind of parts of the industry that will go away, but we do need to plan strategically. I saw there was also a question in the chat about how we do this. Well, in the Netherlands, there's an organization called PBL, which is the Planbureau Leefomgeving. So it's a planning institution about the lived environment, and they've done lots of scenario modeling, looking at scenarios of implementation of the circular economy and looking at different economic scenarios and how that changes the planning of the port. So I think that's very, very interesting. Like, obviously lots of jurisdictions are involved, but there are in fact, ideas in place. But what we need to do is we need to kind of work out I think we need to have honest conversations about what the future of the economy looks like, because if you've got a kind of, let's say, a green growth economy versus an economy of sufficiency, the planning of the port looks very, very different. Now, I expect you don't have to struggle to guess which plan is currently in place. It's very much kind of growth orientated politics, and it's a big debate about a Maas factor 3, so ever growing expansion. But I think that's one of the reasons why we're working with partners at the universities in the area, working closely with groups like Port City Futures at TU Delft that do a lot of work on the spatial dynamics of the Port City territory. We're part of cost action on Port City territories in action, and we're developing our own visions and looking to kind of bring the voice of nature and communities into this debate, in order that we do, in the end, design the port of the future that does operate within planetary boundaries. And we can overcome the challenges that we know that are coming with everything. I hope that answers your question somewhat, and answers also the question that was in the chat.
Thank you, Lucy. I believe it does. It also makes me wonder on, as we know, ports are part of a broader coastal zone, and this coastal zone is also under growing pressure due to climate change, due to sea level rise, and I'm just wondering how important is it to consider that broader context, and also in terms of strategies, linking strategies we produce on port planning to wider coastal adaptation strategies and maritime spatial planning.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Babo. That's a very important question. I think many ports are already preparing for the significant changes we will see due to climate change. Again, turning to the dynamic between Antwerp and Rotterdam, we have seen major efforts, and these have taken years of negotiations to return part of polderland to the rivers and to the sea, in order to give more space in case of floodings before it reaches the ports. So these are decade-long negotiations between two countries to safeguard some major ports and cities from future climate change. So water management all over in Europe is of key importance. I see a great opportunity upcoming in Europe, since the Commission has announced it would be revising the Maritime Spatial Planning Directive. Some of you may remember that directive originally was proposed to be an integrated coastal zone management and maritime spatial planning directive, and I think it's now is a great opportunity to re-establish that link, because the coastal zone is also a connected zone. It doesn't stop at country borders. So if European ports want to effectively be ready to be harmed against rising sea levels and extreme weather events and floods, then I think an integrated approach across borders of coastal planning is key, and linking that as well to how you plan activities on sea is also key. So I see the upcoming revision of this directive as key to the future also of ports and of course coastal cities, and of course nature restoration and protection along the coasts and around ports, especially because it's after all nature which will be our greatest ally in this fight against climate change, and it will be nature in coastal zones that will be the best way to protect against the rising seas, etc.
Thanks a lot. And we need Europe for that. Nature is an ally, and Europe hopefully.
Well, Europe has beautiful targets on restoration and on protection. It's a matter of implementing what has been promised, and I think the problem often lies there. Also on maritime spatial planning, in which Europe has now longer standing experience, we see too often that implementation could be much improved. And this cross-border element is a really important one. That's why we were happy in the European Ocean Pact to see a push towards promoting sea basin planning of maritime activities. And I think if that can be joined also with a sea basin planning of coastal zones, that would be a perfect solution.
Right. Thank you so much. And Lucy, I see in the Q&A section a question popping up that might be of interest for David on the rollout of onshore power. Well, it's not about efuels, but it's on onshore power. Chris Carroll says that ports and EU have been slow to roll out onshore power supply, OPS, with the EU having in place targets for such technology deployment looming for 2030. What can be done to incentivize their deployment and usage? David, would you like to react on that?
Yeah, so what I've seen from working on inland ships is that often there's very little incentive for vessels to plug in. Also, for individual ship owners, it's sometimes cheaper to just run the diesel generators than plugging in. So, twofold way to get around that would be firstly to either oblige ship owners to plug in and enforce it with the same kind of fines that that enforce other rules, such as number of crew that have to be on the ship, but also incentivize ship owners, especially private ship owners who have very small margins and who are actually very efficient in their fuel usage because they're paying their own bills. Incentivize them to get some kind of money back for plugging in. Otherwise, they have a lot of other important work to do as well. So they sometimes might, if they're staying somewhere an hour or two, they might not find the time to plug in. So it's very important to make sure that there are lots of spaces to plug in, but also it's in their interest. As well, on the infrastructure side, that's a very big difficulty, is getting around the grid limitations, because putting the infrastructure on the waterfront is not always where the grid has been built to deliver power to. So then bringing in battery storage and other, maybe hydrogen fuel cells to provide the power for that shore power is something that would definitely drive up the available infrastructure.
Thank you so much. So infrastructure poses challenges. I think it's a recurring theme, and I was actually wondering, David, when I listened to your presentation, so you talked about the small scale, let's say, steps that can be taken in terms of alternative fuel adoption, and the fact that it does not have to mean that we're that there are big spatial issues linked to it. It doesn't have to mean that in the first step. But I was also wondering at the same time, what do you think is needed to make a scale up in the next phase successful? Do we lack funds? Do we lack policy? Is it everything at the same time? What in your view is actually lacking for
yeah?
Scale?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think the first step and the short term is actually the crucial part, because once we have the small scale deployment, then we can get the knowledge, the learnings and the knowledge to scale up. That's what this example of the Norway ferry has shown. And we can, scale up becomes so much easier once you have those first steps. So it would be good the best would be to roll out small steps in a lot of different places. Then on the policy side, what we've seen for green hydrogen production is the most, in the latest IEA report in September, showed that the successful policies for hydrogen production have been those that obligate it. So there have been, the hydrogen in Europe, the example will be the hydrogen bank auction, which it obligates there to be a set amount of hydrogen production that different producers bid for. And there's an interesting example in Norway of a grant that has been awarded to Gen2 Energy, a green hydrogen producer, with the stipulation that 60% of the green hydrogen they produced must be provided for shipping, for maritime sector. So that really obligates an uptake, and it creates the demand for shipping.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much.
And you also just see quickly, I see a question on swapping batteries. So yes, there are inland vessels that are swapping batteries. There's a Dutch company called Zespak, who I believe have 2 vessels now on the water with swapping batteries. So that gets around the issue of long charging times for batteries. The only issue is to have a battery-only powered vessel. They have a lot of weight constraints, which is why fuel cells can kind of make sure that you have, you still have quite a large battery pack, but then you have the fuel cells for the peak demand, and that reduces your overall weight on board. And then for seagoing vessels, the addition of wind propulsion and other energy efficiency operations means you can really get that weight and volume constraint right down.
Mm-hmm.
So in short, yes, it's being deployed, and hopefully will scale up with the learnings.
Yes, let's see. And we still have some minutes left. So to the public, if there's anything you still want to ask to this, if you're interested in panel, don't hesitate and put it in the Q&A. I was wondering, Lucy, we talked a lot about implications of ports and their expansion or this pressure on their spatial aspect to the natural environment. But as was mentioned before, briefly, ports are also adjacent to an urban tissue. How do you think that port planning can take into account that urban environment better, and and find more symbiosis with it? Is it possible? You're from Rotterdam? Are there any interesting projects going on there that you think of that can be an example related? I don't think your mic is on.
Classic mistake. Yeah, this is really important because actually, in the case of Rotterdam, you've got port communities living, almost like adjacent up to the fence of the port itself, and that brings all sorts of problems and challenges. So, there are communities that are already experiencing problems from the port, whether it's kind of noise or congestion or smell or safety issues. So it's like an ongoing challenge, really, to solve those problems and to solve those like environmental issues that people are faced with. But what we have seen over the last years, I think, is a bit more of a disconnection between like the cities and the ports themselves, and we need to re-establish that connection. And we need to also remember that it's not just you've got the port or a city, but actually ports sit within an entire territory that's connected to other hinterland ports and other hinterland cities. So when we are planning for the future, we've also got to take that into account. And I think there are some new particular challenges that are coming around safety and the environment that we need to be particularly mindful of as well. So I think we mentioned, some of the spatial issues around the new hydrogen carriers, so that are less dense, but they have toxicity issues that we need to manage and safety issues. So they will perhaps need far greater safety zones around. So that's also a challenge that needs to be worked out of how do we place infrastructure that keeps people safe, but at the same time we don't put infrastructure on green land or in areas where nature might be harmed. And I think, that is something that's been considered in Rotterdam. There was some consultancy work that was done on like where is it best placed to put ammonia storage, because you've either got a risk to nature from nitrogen deposition or emissions, or you've got a risk for people. So there are trade-offs there, and we're going to need to have cities and communities also having a voice in those decisions, and at certain points it might be like, is this the best place for this infrastructure, and perhaps not to get too kind of sucked in to the kind of the dominant logic of we've just got to put it in the big ports. I mean, that's one of the things is Rotterdam has actually a number of other satellite ports around it, smaller ports. So, there can also be decisions made about where do we perhaps place some of the new infrastructure where there perhaps is a bit more breathing space around the port, or things can be done kind of more safely, or can be integrated into the logistics in a way that's not causing these other problems for people that are living there or on the roads or on logistic hubs. So again, I think it's coming back to this importance for having an ecosystem approach. And when I say that, it's not just that we incorporate nature, but we think of the ecosystem around a port city territory, and we make sure that we've got all of the expertise and all of the right stakeholders engaged in making those decisions.
I'd really like to jump in as well to add to Lucy's comment there, because that's why at Zestes we're really focused on looking at due diligence of alternative fuels. And what we see when we compare pure hydrogen fuel compared to other alternative fuels such as ammonia and methanol is that with pure hydrogen, you really eliminate the risk of toxicity that you see in the other fuels, which means that inherently you have no risk of toxic spills for nature, for people. And then the use of it in a fuel cell means you don't have any air pollution either. So in that, as we would slowly be replacing fossil fuels with green hydrogen, batteries, wind propulsion, then we would naturally see a reduction in pollution and nitrogen loading that would allow nature also to restore in a much greater capacity.
Thanks a lot, David, as well. Anne, is there something you would like to say to complement on that?
To me, it all sounds like there's a need for future prioritization of for space for certain activities. As several of us have already pointed out, prioritizing renewable energy. We haven't talked about offshore renewable energy. That's another one that will require quite some space, both for the construction of the turbines, etc., their transport offshore, also the pipelines that would connect an offshore with the land, etc., an important element. I think the white elephant in the room is maybe also the fact that the world is militarizing. The military sector, that's already clear in examples we've been looking at, like Antwerp and Rotterdam. Ports are preparing for that. So that's a prioritization that is driven by geopolitical developments, but we can't ignore it. I think what Lucy said is the key. This ecosystem-based approach. Sometimes people forget that ecosystem-based approach also includes people. So it is about how people and economic activities can be developed and thrive within the limits of the natural ecosystem. And I think for many ports that would be a shift in worldview and mindset. But I think it's also encouraging to see that certain steps are being made by large and by smaller ports. I think there is reason to be optimist and hope that, for instance, with the upcoming EU port strategy, the message is given that we do not longer follow a kind of a model of always expanding and being in competition between ports and continuing an economy that is focusing on resource extraction. But I hope the new EU strategy will be able to strike a good balance between ecological and climate needs and the role of ports in there, and then also the social needs of workers in ports, but also people living around ports, and most importantly, also making sure that this ecological infrastructure is much enhanced in line with objectives of the Nature Restoration Law, for instance, or in line also with the Water Framework Directive, or in line with the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which aims to turn our oceans into good health by 2020, actually, but let's hope it happens by 2030.
Great. Thank you very much. I feel as if this conversation could go on forever. Sadly, we only have 2 minutes left, so we will have to end the Q&A here. But I guess, if it shows one thing, it's that it's a relevant and important topic. In times of triple planetary crisis, we more than ever need a strong plan for our ports. We need a strategy for the space use, and we also very much need the policies to support this and to complement each other in that. I would like to thank all the speakers for their participation, their presentations, and insightful answers to the questions. And before closing off, I hand over to Sian for the closing remarks. Over to you.
Thank you, Bavo, and thank you to all the speakers. We've reached the end of the webinar, really, and I'd just like to say a few closing remarks. On the screen, hopefully there are a few brief take-home messages from Seas at Risk. Ports are clearly at a crossroad. They can either deepen the crisis, locking in fossil fuel dependency and accelerating ecosystem degradation, or they can lead the transition towards just and equitable maritime future operating within planetary boundaries. With the right policies, governance, and collective vision, we believe that ports can become beacons of regeneration, advancing the well-being of both people, communities, and the planet. Ambitious port strategies, such as that in development within the EU, must be pivotal in this transformation, and we argue that these policies should include delivery of strategic approaches to coastal zone management and to port development, which are guided by a precautionary approach, by an ecosystem approach, and should include cumulative impact assessments and protection of biodiversity and monitoring of change. They should include support for a just and equitable transition with sufficiency and circular economy principles embedded into port governance. And we need to have a just and equitable energy transition, including renewable onshore power supplies and wind readiness for new vessels or wind-assisted propulsion retrofitted to existing vessels. We also need to ensure that there is a requirement for robust environmental and social impact assessments for all new infrastructure, and importantly, that this whole process involves people. It is participatory and that there is social dialogue involved. Bavo has already thanked our speakers, and I would just like to echo those thanks. And also just to thank Bavo and those working behind the scenes to make this webinar run today. And then finally to thank you, the audience, for joining us today and for providing questions and contributing to the discussion. As I said at the beginning, it's our intention to make the recording of the webinar available on Seas at Risk's website. And in the meantime, I hope that you have found today's discussion useful, and we would really welcome any feedback from you on how to make significant progress on this important issue. So thank you, everyone.